Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy. It's brought to you by Ear Ease.
Every year, millions of people suffer from ear pain, especially air travelers and young children.
The Ear Ease, invented by a medical doctor in 1988, has helped tens of thousands of people reduce or eliminate ear pain.
Go to earease.com for more information. That's www.earease.com.
Generic drugs now make up more than 80% of prescriptions dispensed in the U.S. How reliable are they? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Recent scandals involving Indian drug manufacturers have raised concerns about generic drug quality. The FDA has announced it will spend $20 million to test drug quality. Will that solve the problem?
Stethoscopes are the most common tool physicians and nurses use to examine patients. Do these iconic devices spread germs from patient to patient?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, pediatrician Alan Green tells us why skim milk might not be the best choice for toddlers. We'll take your calls and discuss the health stories that matter to you.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health headlines, a study from Sweden suggests that men with early prostate cancer may benefit from radical prostatectomy instead of active surveillance. Roughly 700 men were randomized to undergo surgery or watchful waiting. They were followed up for 23 years. 63 of the men who received surgery died from prostate cancer, compared to 99 of those in the active surveillance group. After 18 years, 18% of the men who had undergone radical prostatectomy had died from prostate cancer, compared to 29% of those in the watchful waiting group. That is an absolute risk reduction of 11 percentage points. The benefit was greatest among men under 65 at diagnosis. These data show that among older men with intermediate risk tumors, radical prostatectomy can save lives.
Stethoscopes are an iconic symbol for healthcare providers. Most physicians and nurses wear a stethoscope draped around their neck for quick access. There are currently no clear guidelines to tell healthcare providers how often a stethoscope should be disinfected. A new study suggests that the diaphragms and tubes of stethoscopes are at least as contaminated as physicians' fingertips after a patient exam. Doctors examined 83 patients in a Swiss teaching hospital. After each exam, the researchers cultured the fingers, hands, and stethoscopes of the examining physicians. In most cases, the stethoscopes were found to have more germs than the doctor's own hands. Because the bell of the stethoscope is often placed directly on patients' skin, that means there could easily be transfer of bacteria from one person to another. Health providers may be slow to adopt stethoscope decontamination between patient encounters, so it will be up to patients themselves to verify that a doctor has washed her hands and cleaned her stethoscope before permitting a physical exam.
A new assessment by the CDC of antibiotic use in hospitals has uncovered some scary statistics. More than a third of the time, drugs prescribed for urinary tract infections are given for too long, are the wrong antibiotic, or were given without confirming which bacteria were causing the problem. The CDC also found that the powerful antibiotic vancomycin was being prescribed too often. In general, the CDC discovered that antibiotic overuse was the norm, with 55% of hospitalized patients getting such medicine. Cutting back on inappropriate use would reduce the likelihood of spreading antibiotic-resistant infections, in particular Clostridium difficile. Also known as C. diff, this bacterial overgrowth often occurs in the aftermath of antibiotic treatment and can cause dangerous diarrhea.
The manufacturers of generic drugs are fighting an FDA proposal that would require them to update the prescribing information when new dangers come to light. This would level the playing field between brand name and generic firms when it comes to product liability. Under current FDA regulations, generic drug companies are not permitted to make any changes in their labeling. As a result of a Supreme Court ruling in 2011, this exempts generic makers from liability for failure to warn of known hazards. The new proposal would require generic drug companies to be responsible for monitoring safety data and updating their prescribing information. Because generic drugs now make up over 80% of all medications prescribed in the U.S., this new proposal should help patients and physicians become aware of newly discovered safety problems more promptly.
For the last 60 years, Americans have been urged to cut back on saturated fat and eat a low-fat diet for the sake of their hearts. According to an editorial in the BMJ journal Open Heart, replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats rich in omega-6 fatty acids, like corn oil or safflower oil, is not based on good science and won't prevent heart disease. Research now suggests that when omega-6 fat consumption goes up, without corresponding increases in anti-inflammatory omega-3 fats, the risks of cardiovascular disease may rise. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon. I'm a pharmacologist.
I'm Terry Graydon. I'm a medical anthropologist. More than 80% of the drugs Americans take are generic. The majority of the active ingredients, and even the final pills, are made abroad in countries like India, China, Brazil, Thailand, Romania, and Mexico, to name just a few. There have been some recent scandals regarding drug quality, especially in India, where a few firms have been banned from exporting drugs to the U.S. The FDA has just announced a reorganization and a new initiative focused on drug quality.
To learn more, we turn to Dr. Janet Woodcock. She's director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Woodcock.
Thank you.
It is a great pleasure to have you on the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Woodcock. In a word, how would you describe your responsibilities at the Food and Drug Administration?
Well, I head up the organization that looks over our medicine supply to make sure that the medicines that Americans get are safe, that they're effective, and that they're of high quality.
You know, it's almost 7 years to the day that we started receiving complaints from visitors to our website, peoplespharmacy.com, about the drug Budeprion XL300. And what people were saying was it's just not working the way the brand name drug Wellbutrin XL300 is working. And after a while, we had literally dozens, scores, and eventually hundreds of people who were complaining about this. It took the FDA several years to take us seriously, but eventually you actually arranged for bioequivalent studies, and you discovered, I think to the surprise of many people at the FDA, that there was a problem with bioequivalence with this drug Budeprion XL300. You found another drug, Bupropion, the generic name, also had a problem. And now we're hearing a lot about problems from India, that a number of generic companies, in particular Ranbaxy, but also Wockhardt, huge pharmaceutical companies that supply generic drugs to the U.S., have had real problems, and you've halted export. So I'm just curious, how concerned is the FDA about all of these issues, and what are you doing?
Well, first of all, the bupropion problem was a different kind of problem. It was a problem that the bioequivalence standards and testing that we did didn't pick up this issue, that it was somewhat different at that dose than the innovator drug. And we have corrected that, and we have new standards in place that should not happen again. The issue of quality problems from India or from the U.S. or from anywhere are sort of ongoing issues that we deal with. We have manufacturing standards for those pharmaceutical companies that make drugs that are either imported into the United States or that they make in the United States. And those standards are all the same. And that ensures that the drugs are of high quality that, Americans take. And sometimes when we take these actions, it doesn't mean that the drugs that people have been taking have been harmful or contaminated or whatever. It means that the production standards that these firms have been using have not been up to the quality that we require. And so that there would be a risk that the products could be at some point of low quality. So we take action, preemptively to make sure those companies come up to standards and make sure that Americans continue to have good drugs.
Now, Dr. Woodcock, as we understand it, there are some difficulties inspecting plants that are producing either active pharmaceutical ingredients or actual medications in other places, such as India or China. How is FDA addressing those problems?
Well, that has been a problem as the industry has moved out of the United States and is producing their drugs all over the world, and then, they're shipped into the United States. But the good news is that the new generic drug user fee program that Congress put into law and the generic industry agreed to, one of the goals of that over 5 years, and we're more than a year into the program, is that we're going to have parity of inspection all around the world. So drugs produced facilities like in China will be inspected at the same frequency as those in the United States.
Now, one quick question about those inspections. If the FDA inspectors were to go to a plant in West Virginia, for example, or perhaps in Puerto Rico, they would arrive unannounced. That's sort of what we come to expect. You want an unannounced inspection so that people can't prepare for it. We understand that's not always true in China or India.
Well, that's not true in a lot of places in the world because visas do have to be arranged, and also there have to be often translators be made available and other logistical plans made for that inspection. So that's true. It's not exactly the same. However, I would point out we don't simply rely on inspections, and focus just on FDA inspections is misguided. We're putting in place a much more intensive surveillance program that will include many additional facets other than simply inspecting the plants.
Dr. Woodcock, is that what the new Office of Pharmaceutical Quality will be doing?
Well, that's certainly part of what that is about. So we are reorganizing ourselves around how we regulate and ensure quality of drugs, and we have a big reorganization in process, and part of that is we have proposed to the industry that they will send us their metrics of their production. In other words, we will get measures. You've probably heard of measures such as Six Sigma, for example, that is a measure of production quality. We're working to develop a set of measures that will be very effective in telling us the status, the quality of production. Now, anyone would say, and we weren't, born yesterday, that in fact people could make up these measurements, but we will do inspections and check against the production records to make sure that companies are reporting the right numbers to us. But this will allow us to have more of a finger on the pulse of how, plants are doing and not simply be relying on those periodic inspections.
Well, one of the things that has those of us who are outside of the inner circle a little puzzled is that there was a huge problem in Puerto Rico several years ago with a GSK plant, a brand name manufacturer. But it wasn't discovered by FDA inspectors. It was only discovered when a whistleblower came forth and said, we've got a problem, and you all better look a little closer. Dinesh Thacker was the whistleblower at Ranbaxy, and until he said, we're fudging data, there's fraud going on, the FDA inspectors hadn't found it. There was a company, I believe, in Houston, Citero, in which FDA inspectors had been to and had looked at what was going on and had given it the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, or more specifically, FDA seal of approval. And then a whistleblower came forth and said, there are problems at Citero. They are fudging data. There's fraud going on. So if the FDA inspectors are missing these kinds of serious problems at places like the GSK plant in Puerto Rico, Ranbaxy in India, or even in Houston, how can we trust the inspectors to be able to find the fraud?
Well, deliberate fraud is amongst the most difficult thing for inspectors to find. And in fact, in clinical trials, which isn't in the generic world so much, we generally learn about fraud from whistleblowers. So that's something that we have to face, that not all inspections will uncover every problem at any place, particularly if there's deliberate fraud. So that's why certain other aspects, such as some testing and other types of data collection and so forth, are helpful. We also have inspectors, as I said, from other countries, so there are multiple inspections done.
Dr. Woodcock, we're also very interested in the idea that FDA, perhaps through the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, will now actually be testing drugs off pharmacy shelves, as it were.
Yeah, we understand that you're going to be committing $20 million to testing generic drugs. That's pretty exciting.
Well, it's a little confusing. Part of the generic drug user fee agreements, was that we would get money to do research. Some of that research is different kinds. Some of it is testing. Some of it is actually clinical testing, such as we did for bupropion, right? And we are continuing to do that where we get complaints. We can conduct our own bioequivalence studies to determine whether the drugs are truly bioequivalent, where serious questions occur. But also some of that research money is going into new dosage forms. I'm sure many of your listeners have complained that certain drugs are not available as generics. For example, some of the inhalants for asthma. And that's because we don't have a good way to test that they're equivalent, that a copy would be just equivalent to the innovator form. And so some of the research dollars will also go into finding out ways to do those tests so that we can have affordable generic copies of those dosage forms.
Dr. Janet Woodcock, we'd like to thank you very much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for the good work that you do.
You've been listening to Dr. Janet Woodcock. She's director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration.
And we'd like to hear from you. Have you had any difficulties with a generic drug? Do you have doubts about quality? Or has your experience been positive? We'd love to hear your story, whether it's pro or con. Our lines are open for your calls at 888-472-3366. Or you can email us. We're radio@peoplespharmacy.com, or reach us through Twitter. We're @peoplespharmacy.
When we come back, we'll take your calls. We'd like to hear your story. That number again, 888-472-3366, or email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Redx Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that moisturize deeply to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
And by We Patients, where you can learn from others about possible triggers and potential treatments for your headaches or migraines, online at wepatients.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of the show, you can call 800-732-2334. It's show number 938. You can find it on the website, peoplespharmacy.com.
Today, we're talking about the stories behind the health headlines. In a bit, we're going to talk about why doctors should wash their stethoscopes as well as their hands between patients. But right now, we'd like to hear from you. What has your experience been with generic medications? Have you found them to be identical to the brand name? Or have you encountered problems? You can give us a call at 888-472-3366. You can send us email. It's radio@peoplespharmacy.com. Or you can send a message by way of Twitter. We're at People's Pharmacy.
Let's go right to the phones. Again, that number, 888-472-3366. Hi, Senator. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy.
Hi, Joanne, and I'm sorry I slipped your name.
It's okay.
My wife takes Synthroid medication, and what I observed is that she initially took some samples from the doctor that were the original medication. Then she was switched to the generic form, and pretty soon she had to go back to the doctor because she wasn't responding to it well. And the doctor's this is what I'm curious about, the doctor's immediate response was, well, I can send you to a specialist, and we can do that now. But we might as well start by doing the first thing any specialist would do, which is to put you back on the non-generic form. And if you respond, and she did respond. So I just found it disturbing, not just that my wife experienced a problem, but that it seemed like the doctors all knew this is a frequent thing, and the first thing you should do is get off the generic.
That's very interesting, Senator. And of course, bupropion is, in fact, the drug that Dr. Woodcock was talking about.
Right. Senator is calling from Charleston, South Carolina. And Senator, I have to say, this is not a story we have heard infrequently, especially with thyroid medication, because a lot of folks have over the last 20 or 30 years claimed that when they got switched to a particular generic thyroid, they had symptoms again, or in some cases they had symptoms of hyperthyroidism.
Well, the FDA has said that all of the generic levothyroxines, which is the thyroid medicine most people take, are okay. But the problem is that you can't switch back and forth between them. So if you get on one, you have to stay on the same manufacturer.
But that's crazy. If they're all identical, which is what the FDA says.
You know, identical is one of those real slippery words.
It is. Senator, thank you so much for your call. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Here's an email, Terry, from LI. I have first-hand experience with the Ranbaxy products. I had taken atenolol, by the way, that's a beta blocker, which is generic, made by Sandoz for years. It worked without any undue side effects. Then the pharmacy switched to atenolol made by Ranbaxy. Worst case of insomnia ever. I talked to the pharmacist who promptly ordered me a bottle of the Sandoz version, which, by the way, is a generic atenolol as well. Problem solved. All versions of a generic drug are not created equal, according to this email.
Well, and that is kind of what we were saying. Some people have discovered with the generic versions of Synthroid, levothyroxine.
Caleb in Charlotte, North Carolina. I apologize if I didn't get your pronunciation of your name correctly. What is your story?
Hey, it feels great to be on your show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, I don't notice a difference between the generics and the main substance.
If you turn your radio off, Caleb, it will make it easier for you and us to hear you, okay?
Yeah.
And by the way, he's talking about a drug called alprazolam, which many of our listeners...
I notice a big difference between the generics themselves.
Right.
I used to get Xanax
right.
or alprazolam from some local company. It was filled with fillers and bonders, and now I get it from Canada, from Greenstone. It works much, much better.
Oh, we're glad to hear that, Caleb. Thanks so much.
That's an interesting story because, I think Greenstone makes what are called authorized generics.
No, I don't think all of Greenstone's drugs are authorized generics, but some of them are. Joe, why don't you tell us what an authorized generic is?
Well, an authorized generic, and I don't think many physicians or patients are aware of this, but there are some generics that are actually made by the brand name company or licensed by the brand name company so that they follow the exact same specifications that may even be made on the same production line as the brand name, and therefore they should be as close to identical as possible. So that may explain why, in that particular case, the alprazolam did work, and in the other case, it didn't.
Joe, we've got another email that says, the generic for Ambien, Zolpidem, did not work for me, and after about 10 days of trying, I went back to Ambien, and I have slept well ever since.
I've heard a lot of stories. There are a lot of people who have complained about generic Ambien, that's Zolpidem, as you mentioned, on our website, saying that when they get switched, they can't get a decent night's sleep. We go to Denton, Texas. Hi, Mary. What's your story?
Hi. I'm sorry. Joe and Terry. I'm sorry.
There you go.
I recently, for the first time, got glipizide XL instead of glucotrol.
Now, that's a diabetes drug.
Yeah, and I thought, and my blood sugar, I was having problems getting it under control. And I thought maybe, well, I've just gained weight, and that's why. But no, I don't. I'm beginning to, because I ran out of the others and then started on the others, and now I seem to be better. Well, and I'm beginning to wonder, if that had anything to do with it.
Well, Mary, you've asked a very interesting question, and actually you are in a position to be able to tell whether there is a difference between the generic drug you have been taking and the brand name drug you have been taking. I assume you keep careful records of your blood sugar readings.
Well, because I hadn't been because of multiple factors, but because I started showing symptoms, I started really checking.
And that's really the best way to be able to demonstrate to the physician or the pharmacist or the insurance company or whoever else needs to know that this generic is not working for you.
We don't encourage people to stop taking generic drugs. I mean, let's face it, the brand name drugs are way more expensive, and oftentimes the insurance companies won't pay for the brand name. So you might end up paying $150 or $200 a month versus $10 or $15 a month. There are very few people who can afford the brand name price. But one of the ways that you can track whether the generic is working correctly is to keep a diary. Now, that's especially true when there are quantitative numbers, quantitative in the sense of blood sugar, or in the case of hemoglobin A1C numbers. And if all of a sudden you discover that you were really well controlled on the brand name or a particular generic, and then all of a sudden you fall off the cliff on another generic, that's pretty good evidence to suggest that there is something wrong. Mary, good luck with that, and let us know how you make out.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm. Bye.
Joe, we have an email from Catherine who says, I feel so bad for arguing with my 89-year-old mother for the last few years. She insisted that the generic equivalents of several of her meds didn't work. Since she's on fixed income, the cost difference is huge. Now I have to call and apologize to her and insist that her doctor examine the situation. The medicines she's taking are for blood pressure and cholesterol control.
All right. Well, sometimes it's important to pay attention to those older folks. They have wisdom. We go to Chatham, Virginia. Hi, Pam. What's on your mind?
Well, I just have a comment about your interview with Dr. Woodcock. It sounded to me like she came through as a hostile witness. It sounds like the FDA uses billions of dollars of tax dollars to dream up standards they can't enforce, and they still have to rely on nothing but whistleblowers. Why not just, don't fund the FDA if they can't do the job, and just cut out that middleman and just try to rely strictly on the whistleblowers?
Well, I really don't think that's a very workable solution, Pam. I don't like to disagree with callers, but I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit because I think it's going to be much too difficult for the market to regulate based on whistleblowers.
Well, here's the problem, Pam. Whistleblowers often get punished. I mean, not just a little bit, but they often lose their jobs. Surprise, surprise. They often are then blackballed from the industry that they may be familiar with, and very few people are motivated to come forth and actually say, hey, there's a problem in my factory, or I've seen fraud firsthand. Now, they can get big settlements, but it may take many, many, many years, and it's not a slam dunk. So I would worry, as Terry has expressed, with solving the problem through whistleblowers, because for every whistleblower, there are probably 10, 15, or even 100 people who are going to be silent. One of the things that I worry about with regard to the Food and Drug Administration is that for a pretty good time, they have relied upon companies to do the right thing. And what we've seen in the last few years is that there are shortcuts. Dr. Woodcock herself wrote a fabulous article in journal Nature in which she basically said, the market, that is to say, we, the public and hospitals and other organizations that buy drugs, we don't reward quality. And because buyers are basically told that every generic drug is identical to every brand name drug, you don't have to worry about quality. Just go for the lowest price. And I think that's what a lot of buyers have done, and we're learning that's maybe a bad policy.
Pam, I think perhaps a little bit of what you heard might have been that Dr. Woodcock was perhaps a little nervous about what we might say, because we've been pretty harsh critics of the FDA at various times. But I think defunding the FDA, getting rid of the FDA, that's really not a great solution. What we need to do is figure out how to make it so that this bureaucracy is not in thrall to the industry that it regulates.
Yeah, Pam, one of the things that I worry about is the fact that the pharmaceutical industry, both brand name and now generic name, are funding the Food and Drug Administration's investigation. And I wish we, the taxpayers, were doing that. I hate it when the government takes money from the industry it's supposed to regulate.
But if the FDA is formulating standards that they know up front, they can't enforce. How does that protect the public?
Well, that's a very good
and
question.
Those
Pam.
are the questions we should be asking, and we should be asking them of the folks who can, in fact, have an influence on the FDA, your congresspeople.
Absolutely. Pam, thank you very much for your provocative call. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Terry, let's talk about stethoscopes.
Absolutely, because there was a very interesting study that was published recently in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings. I think it's in this month's issue of the Mayo Clinic Proceedings. And stethoscopes, Joe, you want to talk about stethoscopes because this is one of your favorite soapbox items.
It is. I guess this is one of those rant alerts.
Yes,
because,
rant alert.
It amazes me that doctors are being encouraged to wash their hands, by everybody. There are campaigns, hospital administrators are doing it, doctors are being told, wash your hands. There's
between every patient, and that's a good thing.
Absolutely a good thing, and doctors are getting much better at it. There are hospitals now that are claiming 90 to 95% hand washing, and they're patting themselves on the back.
As, they have a right to, and usually nurses are even better than doctors.
Indeed.
At hand washing.
But those very same hospitals don't have policies about stethoscopes. And so 80 to 90% of stethoscopes do not get disinfected or cleaned between patients, according to a survey from, I think Consumer Reports mentioned that.
Now, are you going to tell us about this new study from Switzerland?
Well, why don't you give us a few of the details, and then I'll fill in the blanks.
All right. Well, there were 83 patients in the study. It was one study, and I think 71 of them resulted in, after the examination, the doctor's hands were contaminated because they had the physicians examine the patients in a normal examination mode, and then afterwards they took cultures of various parts of the hands, and then the stethoscopes, both the tubes and the diaphragms. And what did they find?
Well, they found that there was a huge contamination, that the stethoscopes were at least as dirty, if not more so, dirty in terms of germs and bacteria, than the hands themselves. And so as a result, they said, doctors need to clean their stethoscopes, disinfect their stethoscopes, especially the bell of the stethoscope, which goes from bare skin to bare skin to bare skin, from patient to patient to patient, and can spread germs just as easily as your hands.
Well, could you ask a doctor to wipe the stethoscope down before using it on you? This is something you actually faced yourself, Joe.
Well, I did. I asked my doctor when was the last time he had disinfected his stethoscope, and he looked at me a little skeptically and said, maybe a week or two ago. And I thought, well, that'll be motivation to get him to disinfect. Right there on the bare skin. I'm curious. Now, I have to admit, I was nervous about doing that. I felt trepidation because you don't want to alienate your doctor, and I didn't want to alienate my physician. I like him a lot. He's great. Could you ask your doctor to wash her hands or clean her stethoscope? We'd like to get your perspective. Give us a call, 888-472-3366. If you don't want to have your voice on the radio, you can email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com. How bold can you be with your doctor when it comes to things like hygiene and stethoscopes?
Joe, we spoke to someone a couple years ago who has devised a very clever tool for doctors and nurses to use. Anyone who uses a stethoscope can put this device right on their uniform, and the bell of the stethoscope then rests in the clean stethoscope gadget and automatically cleans it. It takes 15, 20 seconds. Most of us, it takes more than 15 or 20 seconds in between each patient. So it's going to be automatically cleaned without the doctor or the nurse having to actually take a lot of time to think about wiping it down.
Well, it makes sense. It's called clean stethoscope, and I often wonder when doctors wear that stethoscope around their neck, as they so often do, it's hardly surprising that the tube also gets contaminated. And what about the white coat? And what about the tie? And what about the jewelry? There's evidence to suggest all of those things become contaminated.
Well, what there isn't evidence, though, is whether or not they actually contribute to transmission of disease. That's what you're always hearing from the infectious disease experts, right, Joe?
Exactly. Well, we need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll take your calls, but we'll also talk with pediatrician Alan Green about the milk our children should be drinking. You can join us, 888-472-3366. If our lines are full, email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions, helping dry, cracked skin feel utterly soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
And if you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. It's show number 938. Or you can find it on our website, peoplespharmacy.com.
We're talking about the health news that matters to you. Our lines are open for your calls and questions. Do you have a story to share about an encounter with a doctor regarding hand washing or stethoscopes? You can also share your favorite home remedies. Our lines are open at 888-472-3366 or email us radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
There's been some new research about whole-fat dairy products versus low-fat dairy. To learn about the implications for children, we turn to the People's Pharmacy pediatrician, Dr. Alan Green. He's founder of the children's health website, drgreen.com, and that is green with an E on the end. He's also founder of the White Out Now movement to change how babies are fed and author of Feeding Baby Green.
Now, a lot of parents have been told that whole milk is not good. It's got too much fat in it. And as a result, I think a lot of parents have switched to low-fat or even skim milk, not just for themselves, but also for their children. There's a new study out suggesting that organic whole milk might be beneficial. Can you tell us what that's about?
Sure. A couple things. Backing up a little bit, the recommendation across the country right now is to switch to low-fat or even skim milk once kids are maybe 3 years old or so. But there's not good evidence for that. Every study that's looked at the difference between kids who get a whole milk and the skim milk has shown that they gain as much or more weight when they get the reduced fat milk. They tend to replace the calories they get from the fat with carbs is what ends up happening. In fact, farmers I've talked to said that if you want to fatten up animals, you switch them to skim milk because they'll eat more in the way of carbs. But the question is, what's the fat in the milk? And the study you're talking about is very interesting. The fats that we really need, the good fats that Americans tend to not get enough of, are the omega-3 fats. And those are the ones that reduce inflammation and help your blood be less likely to clot. They're good in many ways. They help build the brain in kids. Omega-6 fats are important too, that can cause inflammation, but we tend to get way too many of those. And organic milk has far higher levels of omega-3s than conventional milk, to the extent that if somebody drinks a glass of organic milk or drinks organic milk, it can do more to improve your omega-3 ratio than even eating fish does, where conventional milk tilts it the opposite direction.
Is that because the cows producing organic milk are out in the meadow eating grass?
I think that's likely to be the big reason. Part of the organic requirement is that they have access to pasture. And one of the places that omega-3s happen is in green leafy vegetables and in grasses. And it used to be that we ate a lot of green leafy vegetables, and the food animals that we eat and that we get milk from were doing the same. But so much of it switched to grains, to soy and corn for the food animals, that the omega-3 levels plummeted.
Dr. Alan Green is a practicing pediatrician, founder of drgreen.com, and founding president of the Society for Participatory Medicine. His books include Raising Baby Green and Feeding Baby Green.
You know, Terry, there's a new study suggesting that whole-fat dairy products don't make grown-ups fat either. This was in the Scandinavian Journal of Primary Healthcare. Middle-aged men consuming high-fat milk, butter, and cream were less likely to become obese over the ensuing 12 years than men who stayed away from high-fat dairy products.
And go figure. And that's not the only one. The European Journal of Nutrition recently had a meta-analysis of 16 observational studies. Those are, usually big cohort studies. The evidence does not support the hypothesis, they conclude, that high-fat dairy foods contribute to obesity and heart disease. In most studies, consuming high-fat dairy was linked to a lower risk of obesity.
So there you have it.
So
that
seems like it's turning the whole apple cart, as it were, upside down, or the dairy wagon.
Yeah. Well, we'd like to get your opinions on stethoscope cleaning, hand washing, and dairy food. Let's go right to the phones, 888-472-3366. Where are we going first, Terry?
Let's go to Newton, North Carolina, and talk to Henry. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Henry.
Hi, Joe and Terry. How are you?
We're doing well. We understand you're a paramedic?
Yes, sir.
So what's the story?
Well, because sometimes we deal with more than one patient at a time, sometimes it's kind of short cleaning from call to call. We found that if you cut the thumb off of the non-latex gloves and just pull it over the bell, all you have to do is remove that. And if you don't have a chance to clean, you still have a clean stethoscope for your next patient.
Okay, so what you're doing is, this is not the glove you're wearing, but a different glove. You're covering it with, okay.
Basically, you're talking about a condom for your stethoscope.
Correct.
Okay, what a cool idea, Henry. Thanks for
Thank you
thanks
for
that.
sharing that idea. Kind of like that idea. Let's go to Starla in Custer, South Dakota. Hi, Starla. What's your suggestion?
Well, hi, Joe and Terry. Well, after hearing you on the People's Pharmacy about washing the hands many months ago, I went to the physician and I told my daughter I'm taking my Purell hand sanitizer in with me, and just as the doctor was coming in the door, I squirted it on my hands and rubbed it around, and she went straight to the sink and washed her hands.
Oh, what a good idea, Starla.
Do it all the time.
Good for you.
Well, Starla, what a wonderful role model. And without saying a word, your doctor got the hint.
Yes, and I just thought, you know what? I'm going to do it all the time. Just as, a friendly reminder I didn't want to feel, like I was intimidating them by asking them. So I thought, well, I'll just do this and see if it works, and it did.
Starla, that is a great suggestion. I think we're going to adopt it. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
And Joe, we've got an email from Dr. George Schaefer in Dunedin, Florida. He says, first of all, he'd like to see all prescriptions labeled with the country where the medicine was produced. That's the first thing. Second thing is on stethoscopes. What are you going to do about keychains, wallets, belts, pens, wristwatches? And he could go on, but we won't.
We won't. I'm not going to worry too much about your wallet or your keys. They don't come in contact with the patient, but the stethoscope and your hands do. And so I'm going to care about those.
And in fact, when it comes to wristwatches and
jewelry,
hand jewelry, rings, and that sort of thing, bracelets, the National Health Service in Great Britain actually banned all those items, about 2 or 3 years ago?
Or more, exactly.
And precisely because they ran the risk of coming in contact with patients because they are hard to clean thoroughly and, could be damaged by cleaning solutions. So there you have it.
Here's an email message from a physician. Cardioversion is the name. He says, I'll confess I'm bad about cleaning my stethoscope sometimes. I'm a lot better about cleaning it when there are sanitizers right outside or inside the patient's room. Otherwise, I tell myself I'll clean it when I pull it out again, and then I forget. The worst is when you take it apart and find all the built-up dust and gunk in the crevices. Ooh, yuck. Let's go to Rita in Lake Wells, Florida. Hi, Rita. You're on the People's Pharmacy.
Hi, Joe and Terry. I just wanted to say that as well as the stethoscope is the blood pressure cuff. I took my mom once to her doctor when she had ringworm, and I mentioned it to the nurse as a precaution, and she appreciated that. But I wonder how often people have issues that they're not mentioning or they don't even know about. And I always thought the blood pressure cuff was a problem since it's fabric and you don't wash it.
Very good point, Rita. That's something we also have wondered about, and I don't know of a good solution. Sometimes if a patient has something that's really very transmissible and dangerous, like MRSA, they will actually keep the patient in one room and kind of isolate them, and that blood pressure cuff for that room doesn't leave that room.
Nor does the stethoscope.
Right.
And what some hospitals have done is they've taken to providing these patients with very bright colored stethoscopes, orange or red.
So they're easy to spot.
Yeah, and the doctors don't take them out of the room. The idea of having disposable blood pressure cuffs or a blood pressure cuff that comes with the patient when they check in and stays with the patient and then leaves with the patient, I kind of like that idea. Might be a little tricky in the emergency department, but yes, you wonder when you look at some of those blood pressure cuffs that have been there on the wall for maybe, 2 or 3 years, and you kind of have a funny feeling like, I wonder how clean they are. Answer, probably not very.
Joe, we've got email from Kevin who says, His name actually is Kevin Trice, MD, and he is an entrepreneur. He has a company called Pulmonary Apps. But what he wants to tell us is not only is the stethoscope dirty, but it doesn't work very well. The design hasn't been changed in 150 years. And his company is looking to not only decrease the risk of infection, but also allow for remote real-time lung sounds monitoring. Imagine if your doctor could see and hear your asthmatic child's lung sounds without you having to run to the emergency department. Or if your loved one's heart failure and emphysema could be monitored. And this would dramatically reduce the subjective way we monitor lung sounds. So, Kevin's got something he's planning to bring to market. We'll be interested to see what it is when it comes.
You bet. We're running out of time, but I'd really like to get your perspective on dairy foods. Are you one of those people who buys skim milk? I know we are. What about low-fat yogurt? The idea of having, full-fat yogurt, it seems like such a sin, such a luxury. That Greek yogurt, it's so good. But we think, well, it's high in fat. Maybe it'll be bad for our hearts. Maybe it'll be bad for our waistlines. Maybe we were wrong, right, Terry? Maybe that high-fat yogurt, the full-fat...
Oh, I actually love that stuff.
Yeah.
We don't eat it very often because I have not been keeping up with the literature until just now that shows that high-fat dairy is better for you, perhaps, than, skim milk dairy. But I do love the full-fat yogurt.
Let's go to Lancaster, Wisconsin. Hi, Bill. You're on the People's Pharmacy. What is your point?
Hi, I'm in the dairy, or America's heartland for the dairy, and my question is, the debate rages between raw milk and pasteurized milk. Is the advantage to the raw milk based on the fact that the milk is whole and unhomogenized, or is the advantage to the fact that it is unpasteurized?
Well, actually, we weren't talking about raw milk, and I don't think we actually are going to talk about raw milk right now because we don't have an expert to address it. It is a tremendously controversial and also very politicized topic.
It is. And, of course, the concern, Bill, is that without pasteurization, you're going to pass along germs and people are going to get sick. And that's especially true with the very large dairy, the dairy operations that are more, manufacturing almost than they are like the old dairy farm that I grew up on, where my uncle had, 30, 40 head of cattle, and they roamed the pastures. They were his friends. Every cow had a name. They were treated with a great deal of respect and kindness. And a lot of the milking got done by hand. And yes, we did make cottage cheese from the milk, and we did drink it. It was not homogenized. It was not pasteurized. But those days are hard to find. Well, maybe they're coming back. That would be interesting.
But what Dr. Green was talking about was the issue of full-fat organic milk versus skim milk that's been produced not in an organic way. And Joe Elliott emailed to say that he's not aware that organic dairy is by definition grass-fed. He said it might be grass-fed part of the time, but studies have shown there's a significant increase in CLAs, that's conjugated linoleic acids, which are fatty acids that presumably are healthy for us, and other omega-3s in cows that were exclusively grass-fed. So that may actually be what we're looking at here, and what we're aiming for is grass-fed cattle giving us milk.
We go to Tampa, Florida. Hi, Fonda. What's your question or comment?
Hello, Joe and Terry. I am a big fan of organically processed, grown dairy products. And mainly because of the antibiotics and the human growth hormone, or not human, I'm sorry, bovine growth hormone that cows may get at the groceries, that just sold at the grocery stores. But the organic won't have all of that. And our liver has to process those chemicals. So it's better in that respect as well. And also, it's so much kinder to the cows.
Amen to that. I appreciate the call, Fonda. Again, having grown up on a dairy farm, I have a great deal of fondness for those cows. And, Suki, I remember Suki and Bessie. I mean, everyone had
some
a name.
Some old-fashioned names, I'll bet, on those old-fashioned cows from your childhood, Joe.
Absolutely. I was never very good at milking cows, I have to admit.
You were pretty little when this was going on.
I was pretty little. And once the bull came chasing after me, and my mom almost had a heart attack. But that's a story for another day.
Yes, it is. So have we turned everything that we used to know about healthy eating upside down?
Well, we were told for a long time that eggs were bad and we should get rid of eggs, and now eggs are back and it's okay to have an egg once or twice, maybe even more during the course of the week. Maybe it's okay to have that Greek delicious whole-fat yogurt too.
It might be. And you know what? Even some chocolate once in a while might be good for you.
There was a new study just out on dark chocolate.
There was, and it was pretty fascinating.
It showed that chocolate, again, increases flexibility of blood vessels.
It also showed that chocolate reduces inflammation. They were looking at leukocytes, so this is the first time that it's been looked at. But what fascinated me is they compared a high flavanol and a low flavanol chocolate, and the men getting the low flavanol chocolate did just as well.
Oh, well, there you have it.
Pretty interesting.
Pretty cool. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for listening to The People's Pharmacy.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Sophie Copeland provided technical assistance. Al Wodarski is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
To order today's show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 938. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can find it on our website. That's peoplespharmacy.com. When you go to the website, you will find an extended interview with Dr. Janet Woodcock. Now, Dr. Woodcock is arguably the most important person at the Food and Drug Administration when it comes to medications, both their approval and also their oversight. So if you want to get the full story from Dr. Woodcock, check it out on the website. It should be there probably by Monday. There's also other information about prescription drugs, dietary supplements, herbs, and home remedies. Read about other people's experiences with generic drugs or share your own.
You can also sign up for our free email newsletter or subscribe to the free podcast of our show. And that way you can share the program with a friend. You can also get in touch with us at peoplespharmacy.com. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Thanks so much for listening, and please join us again next week. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.